All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to begin our event momentarily. Everyone is able to see our presenter, Maurice, as well as our slides. Let's make sure here. Okay, so I got one more minute and then we're going to get started. Let's talk on my screens here. All right, good morning, everyone. I can see you've got some attendees. I'd like to take a moment and recognize that we're all back in the classroom. And so thank you to our QP workers for all of their hard work. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to see unions come together and get things done. So it's great to be back in the classroom. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Gonzalez, and I'm a curriculum consultant with Halton Catholic, specifically in the areas of equity and inclusive education. And today I have the honor of introducing Maurice Switzer, who is going to be giving us a presentation on treaties, how Canada really began. And before we start, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land. As we know, this week is Treaties Recognition Week, and so we acknowledge that all lands are treaty lands. And today I'm coming from the Brant Tract, which was signed in 1795. And you can kind of see there on the map where I'm located specifically. And as we are gathered here on Indigenous lands, we thank specifically the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and all the ancestors who walked gently before us. In addition to acknowledging the land, I'd also like to recognize that Tuesday, November 8th is Indigenous Veterans Day. So I'm just going to play a video that commemorates the contributions of Indigenous veterans. And as we gather together in gratitude, I would like to offer this Treaty Week prayer. And so I invite you, if you feel comfortable in your classes, to join us in the sign of our faith. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Let us remember that Indigenous peoples Let us remember that Indigenous peoples gently walk this land. Let us remember that treaties are promises. Let us respect those promises. Let us remember all of the promises in our lives. Let us remember that bullying causes pain and hurt. Let us remember to be kind to everyone. Let us remember to stick up for someone who's being bullied. Let us remember to treat others the way we want to be treated. Let us remember to love our neighbors. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. And I'd like to welcome Maurice Switzer, who is a citizen of Mississauga's of Alderville First Nation and currently lives in North Bay. His grandfather, Moses Muskrat Marsden, was chief from 1905 to 1909. Maurice was the first Indigenous student at Trent University and the first Indigenous publisher of a Canadian daily newspaper. And currently, Maurice is also a commissioner for the Ontario Human Rights. And so I'm just going to hand it over to Maurice in a moment. Go. Sure, I can see everyone. Perfect. Okay. All right, Maurice, I'm going to mute my mic, and when you are ready, go ahead and you can just let me know next slide and I will change the slides. There's a bit of a lag, so just give it a moment.
Hey, well, thanks so much, Amanda, for being my host and for those wonderful introductory comments. I should add I'm not currently a member of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, but I do serve on the still serve on the Commission's Reconciliation Advisory Working Group. So I still keep very close connections, you know, with the work of the Commission in advancing human rights. I want to start by introducing myself in Anishinaabemowin, which is one of about 40 Indigenous languages that were being spoken on these lands we call Canada for thousands of years before the languages that are now known as Canada's official languages. I'm glad to say that at least two provinces have symbolically recognized the importance of that fact. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have passed legislation that recognizes Indigenous languages in their territories as first languages, and that means a lot. So I'm going to introduce myself, you know, as to you as my friends, and tell you a name I've been given, Benesi, which is a type of bird, and I'm going to tell you the clans that I carry. Through my grandfather, Moses Muskrat Marsden, that's Anishinaabeg, and my clan is Wajashk or Muskrat. And through my great-grandmother, Esther Hill, from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, Amakwaho, which is wolf. And I'm going to tell you that that I live in North Bay, and my Indigenous roots are in the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, which is a sister community to the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm going to say that I'm a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation and nations that make treaties today. I'm also proud, just as an addendum, I'm proud of my Jewish heritage. My birth father's name was Harold Switzer. I was born in Toronto, and my grandparents, refugees from what was then Russia, Imperial Russia, around 1900. So I'm proud of both my heritages, and they have helped give me unique insights into what it's like to be part of marginalized populations. So, Ani Bojo, Niji, Benesi Dijnikas, Wajashk, Dodom, Michisagig, Anishinaabe, Kwakwaho, Kanien'kehá:ka, Haudenosaunee, Alderville, Donjibad, North Bay Indian, Anishinaabe, and Dao. So greetings, everybody, and it's important to remember, as Amanda indicated in that wonderful slide, that today has been designated as National Indigenous Veterans Day. Remembrance Day, of course, nationally is coming up this Friday, but it's really pertinent to to remember the role that Indigenous people have played in defending what we now call Canada. And nobody has done that longer than Indigenous peoples. They've been defending these lands. I guess you could say they originally defended the lands about 1,000 years ago when the Vikings tried to invade. People who came in peace were always welcomed, and as part of our relationships with newcomers that arrived, we tended to be their allies against foreign invasion, and that was the case in the War of 1812, the only war ever fought on Canadian soil, when Canada's Defence Force largely consisted of 10,000 Indigenous warriors, because there were no troops in this part of what was then Canada's. No, significantly very few colonial troops, and when an American army invaded, huge numbers, I think there were about 30,000 soldiers in the American army. Those Indigenous warriors fended them off, and historians agree that if it weren't for that contribution, that Canada would probably not exist today, and we would be part of the United States. So, really important to remember those, particularly during this week. It's significant that Treaties Recognition Week falls around these important days of remembrance. And treaties were really significant in that because of those agreements, the Indigenous warriors, because of the promises that their ancestors had made, still feel that obligation to defend these lands, because those were the promises they made in return for the promises that were made to them, that he would defend these lands. So the official title that Amanda gave was Treaties where, when Canada really began, and sometimes people tend to think that Canada every July 1st, when people celebrate what's known as Canada Day, students are taught that, of course, on July 1st, 1867, the fathers of Confederation, as they're called, people like Sir Johnny Macdonald, they created this country that's Canada, and that's not very long ago. That's only 155 years ago. But I'm going to try to make a case for you today that never would have happened if it hadn't been for treaties, the treaty relationship, the agreements made with the First Peoples who were on these lands, by which they agreed to share their lands. And to me, that's when Canada really began, at least a century before July 1st, 1807. So let's start our slides. Thanks. Go to the next one. And when we talk about a treaty, the dictionary says that a treaty is a formally concluded and ratified agreement between states. And the difference we're going to talk about today is that Indigenous peoples regard treaties that they made as sacred agreements. There's a spiritual element to them, not just a contractual one. Go to the next slide. And here's an example of a modern treaty, that gentleman in the middle, the former president of the United States. This is an example of sometimes how treaties have deteriorated in their meaning, because that gentleman, when he was President of the United States decided that he didn't like the terms of the North American Free Trade Agreement between his country and Canada and Mexico, and he just said, we want another one. And you know, we are taught that treaties are solemn agreements, legally binding, and it's really a mark against your reputation if you break these kind of very serious commitments, particularly on the national level, of course. But in your prayer, I saw there was a reminder for the importance to all of us to keep our promises. So if we lived in a society where people didn't keep their promises, it would be just absolute chaos. Be no rules of law. There would be no order. It would just be pandemonium. So, at the highest level, so important to make sure that your word is your bond. That you have that reputation. And in Canada, in dealing with treaties, they say the honor of the crown is at stake, and the crown is our national institution that represents our laws and our government. So next, please. And today, primarily, we're going to be talking about Indian treaties, and I'm going to use that word Indian in its historic sense. A lot of people don't like using it, even though it's still widely in use. Canada, the 1.6 million Indigenous peoples like me still live under the Indian Act, and I work for an organization called the Union of Ontario Indians. It's still called that. Terminology is kind of a moving target. Used to talk about Eskimos, and now we talk about Inuit. And the word indigenous is now kind of in vogue, and it used to be Aboriginal. And one of the things that's problematic about words like indigenous is that it tends to lump three very different peoples together: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And so there's some people who find that problematic. It's convenient for people who want to save on the number of letters that they use when they're typing, or maybe space on their business card. But it's important because even among First Nations, that are the largest of those three groups, there's great variance in our customs, our traditions, our beliefs, and our languages. So, but this is a typical illustration of what a treaty might have looked like, probably in Western Canada in the leading up to Confederation. And you can see a treaty commissioner representing the colonial government sitting under that canopy, and a military presence was usually there for these treaty days, and sometimes that was used to try to intimidate the Indians into agreeing with the terms of the agreement that was translated for them. Next, please. So this is the event that I like to say really was probably the event that made Canada possible, because after the British had become the dominant colonial power, European colonial power in North America, they wanted to start colonies in what is now Canada and the United States, as they had all around the world. And like other European countries, they were very small land bases. They were looking for more territory. They were looking for more resources, more wealth, and but they had seen how fiercely the Indians defended their territory. So they thought, we're going to try diplomacy. In many parts of the world, the British Empire, with its mighty army and fleet of hundreds of ships, had just walked in, and sometimes there were battles. Many times there were battles in places like India. in Asia and in Australia, but that wasn't the case here because the British wisely decided they would attempt some form of diplomacy, and that diplomacy would take the form of treaties. And so on in the summer of 1764, that's 103 years before Confederation, the mighty British Empire had asked for a meeting of the chiefs of people they called the Indian tribes of North America. And in the center of the continent were about 24 nations who were expected to attend from above and below the Great Lakes. And the man who was sent to try to treat with them, that's what you say when you want to make a treaty agreement, was Sir William Johnson, who was the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for British North America. And that was a huge job. And that included the indigenous nations that are now south of what we now call Canada, and in the neighborhood of the emerging 13 colonies of what's now the United States. So his role was to ask the representatives of those nations, and it was the largest gathering that had ever been held of Indian chiefs in North America. There were the estimates run as high as 3,000 were at this gathering. This picture shows it was near Niagara Falls. It was actually further away down at Fort Niagara, across from Niagara on the lake. But we wanted the picture to sort of be self-evident. And so Sir William Johnson, at a number of meetings over the course of that summer, presented, you can see he's got in his hands a wampum belt, which is woven from beads of very sacred seashells into images that sort of told stories of the agreements, because the Indian peoples did not speak English. They had to rely on translators to understand what they were being asked, and they didn't use paper and pens. They used the wampum belts, sashes that were woven out of these beads. These were their documents. And Sir William Johnson said, if you take up this belt with the English, we will always be your friends, and in peace and in war, and we will bring you anything you need in our ships, and you will never be poor as long as the world exists. And to prove that, they unloaded 30,000 gifts from about a dozen British ships that were anchored in the Niagara River, distributed them among those chiefs. And there were guns and ammunition and blankets and pots and pans and metal items that they didn't have. And he also distributed 6,000 pounds sterling of English currency, which today has a purchasing power of $20 million. This was one of the major events in the history of these lands, and it was never mentioned in textbooks for most of Canada's first 100 years. And these stories are just being told now. I've had to learn these things because I wasn't taught them in school. Most of your teachers weren't taught them in school. Your parents and grandparents probably weren't taught them. So you students now are among the first peoples in this country's history to learn about, all of these amazing stories about Canada's past. Next, please. And here's, this shows how this wampum came into being. You can see the two main shells on the left. One with purple around the edge is called a quag. The Maritimers call it quag. It's spelled Q-U-A-H-O-G. And the other shell from where the white beads often came is called a whelk. And Indigenous peoples have always had high regard for things that live in the water, because we understand that water is the source of all our life. We're all born water through our mothers. About 3/4 of the world's surface is covered with water. It's the source of all life. And they have actually found those shells quags that are 500 years old. So they've been designated the oldest living things that have ever been found, the oldest living creatures that have ever been found. There, of course, trees have been found that are older than that, but the oldest living creatures, so very special. And initially, the people closest to the Atlantic Ocean would have, of course, used these shells first, and later they would have been traded inland. They would make wampum strings, as you see in the center of that top photo. That would be, maybe that would be a way to identify yourself. Maybe a chief would have the different color beads in a certain order and would send a message to another chief, and it would be identified by that wampum string. And you can see in the right picture at the top that they're woven on a loom, just like cloth is woven. And it was very painstaking work. They said it would take a woman as long as 2 days to craft one single bead from that quag shell. And they had to be polished to be almost exactly identical in size, or they couldn't be woven together. And we're still not 100% sure how they drilled a hole just about 1 millimeter across without any metal tools. So that's painstaking work, and that belt below is the belt that was given by Sir William Johnson to those chiefs at Niagara. He would have, in a number of meetings during that summer, would have shown that belt and asked the chiefs to accept the promises that came with it. And there are 10,076 beads in that belt. And so again, when you know that it might take as long as 2 days to make one bead, you can see how much work would have gone into it. And Sir William Johnson's partner, a woman named Mary Brant, sometimes called Molly, and who was the sister of that man mentioned in the introduction, Joseph Brant. She was from a prominent Mohawk family in what's now New York State, where Sir William Johnson and she lived, and she knew the customs of people who used wampum a lot in their ceremonies. She undoubtedly was responsible for telling him how important this would be, make his promises to the chiefs. And you can see that the central image is basically two people holding hands, which was still is an international gesture of friendship and peace and alliance, and the date, of course, is on that belt. And so those other images could be of council fires. They have also been interpreted as representing what's called the dish with one spoon, which a treaty that symbolically indicates that there is enough game and resource in our territories for us to share. Next slide, please. This is that central image. You can see, and these belts are, many replicas are being made and used as teaching aids. But you can see the one thing that they have in common is that the hearts of those two characters was shown as being different. That was to indicate, we believe that the indigenous character is the one on the left, because that indication of the heart is similar to how it's shown in other wampum belts. And the other would represent the European. That just shows that recognizes there was a difference in the people. And also, it indicates the fact that it was important to weave the hearts in, shows that indigenous peoples believed that these agreements that these belts signified were sacred events. They weren't just contractual or legal, they were sacred because the heart is shown. Next. And treaties go right across this country. You can see the dates of the treaties. The first treaties would have been in the 1700s. And they would have started as the Europeans first arrived on the shores of the Maritimes. Most of those agreements were There's peace and friendship. The newcomers that came here were quite terrified by when they saw people that were different from them, and they wanted to make peace with them. And as I said earlier, as long as they came in peace, they were welcomed and shown how to, given survival skills, what to eat, what was safe to eat, how to travel, how to make a canoe, how to make snowshoes, how to get sweetener out of a maple tree, and how to build lodges, and where the safe places to travel by land and water were. These people came as refugees, and these treaties really helped them survive. Now, unfortunately, as the number of settlers increased in great numbers, and as Canada started moving towards becoming a country, the treaty process sort of deteriorated from how it had begun, and it was by the time these treaties came into being, these early ones, just after Confederation, they were numbered as the government made treaties east to west. They became an attempt really just to get the Indians off their land, and that's a sad chapter, and it's one reason why today so many of these agreements end up in the courts. Next. Every square centimeter of the province of Ontario is under treaty, and you know you're in the people that from your board are involved in a number of treaty areas. I believe the closest one to where you are might be Treaty 13, which is called the Toronto Purchase. Some of these have been resolved, others haven't, and many of these treaties came into effect, what they call the pre-Confederation treaties, because after the Americans colonists decided they didn't want to be part of the British Empire anymore, and they fought a revolution to break away, the people who were loyal to the British Crown, we call them United Empire Loyalists, they were forced to sort of flee what was becoming the United States. And the British colonial governments tried to make room for them north of the border, and to do that, they had to make treaties and agreements with the indigenous peoples who lived on those lands to provide space for the newcomers. And some of the treaties in your area, negotiated with the indigenous peoples by the British colonial government to make room for people who had led the American Revolution. You can see the size of some of those treaties. Treaty 9 covers about half of Ontario. Next. Now, one of the things that people have to understand is that again, the Indians, as I'm calling them, could not speak English in general. They could not write English, but they were involved in agreements to share their land, and they did not. It wasn't always translated accurately for them what the agreement said in writing, and that's again the reason why many of these treaties have ended up in courts. Because they're not examples of honor of the crown, fair dealing, as they say. And here's a treaty number 77, which became known as the Rice Lake Surrender. And my community, Alderville, is shores of Rice Lake, and our leaders at the time in 1856 were asked to surrender this land, although that word was never translated for them. And you can see there are words in there like surrender, forever quit, cede, C-E-D-E, which means to give up. And those were the words that were in the written document. And the people whose names are below, one of whom is a relative of mine, Thomas Marsden, they were never led to believe they were doing anything but sharing the use of their lands. They never were told that they would in any way disrupt their lifestyle of hunting and fishing for subsistence. But if you go to the next slide, you can see something very interesting. You can see all of those chiefs' names, all written in the same hand, and that means, because they couldn't write their names, that a treaty clerk representing the colonial government wrote their names, and the only thing they could do to indicate their approval, if they agreed with the terms of the agreement as it was translated to them, was write their clan sign. For example, you heard me say that grandfather I have Wajashk or Muskrat clan, and that little figure at the bottom of that row, that would have been looked like a muskrat, and that's how they indicated their agreement. And government seal, where it says seal at the right, they would have melted those red wax seals to make it all official. This is how just about all of Canada's 10 million square kilometers changed hands, not by conquest, as happened in other parts of the world, but the colonial government, the British colonial government, made these kind of agreements. In many cases, the Indians were under stress of having their societies weakened, but this is the type of agreement that saw all of these lands change hands when the Indians thought they were sharing them. And I can guarantee you that this sort of agreement would never be considered legal today by any lawyer or judge. For one thing, just the fact they couldn't read or know the agreement in the language in which it was written would make it null and void. People have to understand, this is what happened. This is how Canada came to occupy so much of this land and start enjoying the wealth from it. Next slide, please. I mentioned the War of 1812 because 48 years after that great treaty gathering at Niagara, when they had promised to be allies of the British, this was the first major promise that that those Indian chiefs kept. There would have been treaty meetings every year to remind the British of their promises, and there would have been more. They called them gifts or presents, but it was really rent or coal. When the British most of their soldiers were back in France at this time fighting Napoleon, the 10,000 Indigenous warriors were defending Canada against this invasion. And you may have heard names like Tecumseh, but there are other names that should have been in our history books, names like Meskwaki and Shawundas and Siganak and Oshawanu, and these are great heroes, Akinawalik, some of the greatest war heroes in Canadian history, and their names are not known by many people across the country. They haven't been in our textbooks, and this, when we talk about Remembrance Day, or Indigenous Veterans Day and Remembrance Day, these are pivotal to Canada's history, and there's no greater contribution that Indigenous peoples have made than defending land against its only invasion, this war. Next, please. So, as we said earlier, 103 years after that great event at Niagara, the colonial governments decided that they were going to try to start creating a nation called Canada. Canada is said to come from an Iroquois word, Canada, which means a village. There's still a suburb of Ottawa called Canada, by the way. And so they gathered and in Charlottetown and in Quebec City, and they started creating Canada out of initially 4 provinces. And this would never have been possible if the Indian leaders had not agreed to start sharing the use of their land. And And by the time the threat of war with France first, and then in the American invaders in the War of 1812, the number of settlers started increasing exponentially, and all of a sudden, by the middle of the 19th century, the number of primarily British immigrants in what was becoming Canada overwhelmed the Indigenous populations, and that unfortunately, what started as a relationship between equals sort of deteriorated into a master and slave almost relationship, such as had existed for thousands of years in Europe. Of course, there was considered they were very class conscious, and they did no longer by this time regard the first peoples who were here, who welcomed them as newcomers. They no longer regarded them as being equal relationship. Next. And the reason you might have seen news stories of people who don't, Indigenous peoples who don't particularly like the idea of there being statues, people like Johnny MacDonald, who's many people called the father of Confederation, first Prime Minister of Canada. If you wonder why a lot of Indigenous peoples don't particularly care that his name is on schools, it's because this is the sort of thing that he said. By the time of Confederation, they just wanted to get the Indians off their land. They had visions to expand settlement out west. They were giving land away. It wasn't theirs to give. They were offering it free for settlers who out there. They wanted to build a railway all the way to the west coast because they felt that was one way to secure Canadian title, because they didn't want the Americans to be fearing in the land base that was becoming Canada. And Sir Johnny MacDonald is recorded standing up in the House of Commons and referring to Indigenous peoples as savages and half-breeds, and proudly saying in Parliament that when he was asked how they planned on getting the lands that were required to build the railway and to expand settlement, proudly saying, well, we're going to starve them by withholding rations that we promised them. And they started herding Indigenous peoples onto what are called reserves. There are about 634 First Nations that have reserve lands now, but they were like little ghettos to get the Indigenous peoples out of the way of settlers. And you can see the comment below about a Mississauga chief who said, when your people came here as refugees, as I said, we welcomed you, we nursed you, and we protected you. And it was like planting a little tree, and when it became a big tree, you started to lash us with your branches. So very metaphorical way, very heartfelt speech. Next. So all that's left of all those lands that were once solely occupied by First Nations people, by Indians, are those little red dots. And you heard me mention First Nations. There's 634 communities across Canada, and if you live on a First Nation reserve, you do not own the land underneath your house. That is held in trust for you by the government of Canada. And one of the reasons why the majority of First Nations people left their reserves, like my grandfather left his reserve about 100 years ago, was they were usually in remote locations. There was no employment opportunities. Most of them had no schools. So in Ontario, for example, 85% of Indigenous people like me, live in urban centers, in cities. I'm living in North Bay. And, it's the people who live in those reserves that were created in places that they didn't ask for. often were removed from their traditional hunting grounds. They have not enjoyed the benefits of their treaty partners. People who were non-Indigenous enjoyed all the benefits of the land that was shared with them, of the wealth that was taken from the land, the mineral wealth, the forest wealth. And so most people in Canada live in urban settings where they have paved roads and nice schools and hospitals and clean drinking water and all of those benefits that they can take for granted. And while the people who live in those on those reserves, many of them, most of them, don't enjoy anything near those sort of benefits. So these are not the things that were promised in the treaties, particularly that great Treaty of Niagara, where Sir William Johnson said, if you accept our promises to share your land, your people will never be poor as long as the world exists. Next, please. So the chiefs during the treaties after Confederation were usually given medals that showed the reigning monarch, in this case Queen Victoria, on one side, and on the other side the treaty commissioner who represented the colonial government, and is seen shaking hands again. That handshake, that universal symbol of peace and friendship. And at the chief's feet is a tomahawk, a weapon, showing that this agreement meant there was war. They were allies with the British. And behind the treaty commissioner is that sun. Again, the treaty commissioners always promised that the things they promised would be exchanged as long as the sun rises in the east, forever. And the kind of promises that were made, this medal is from Treaty 6 out west, 4, I think, out west. And they would promise things like, we will always provide you with a medicine chest. That means health care. We will always provide you with a schoolhouse. That means education. All of those promises have not been honored, unfortunately. Next. Some of the treaties, in addition to to providing some, they called them presents up front. It's rent for using the land. Some of them called for annuities, which meant every year there would be a gathering, and they were supposed to remind one another of the promises that had been made. And the annuities, which started, in this case, this would be Treaty 9, this would be 1909. And that's probably a $5 bill that the treaty commissioner is handing that Indian chief. And he's wearing a nice new set of clothes, by the way. And one of the promises that were often made to chiefs if they agreed to the treaties was that you have a new suit of clothes every year. That has not happened for many, many, many decades. Another simple promise, but a promise that was not kept. So next slide. And these annual treaty meetings still take place. And unfortunately, the amount that was promised in some cases 150 years ago has not changed. And for example, at the treaty in the area where I'm living, the Robinson-Huron Treaty, those people have been receiving $4 a year. The First Nations people from those 30 communities involved in the treaty, they're still getting $4 a year. Same $4 they were receiving in 1874. And that's one reason why this treaty has found its way to the Supreme Court of Canada, because it's not in the spirit and intent of the treaty that when the wealth that's taken out of those Indian lands goes up exponentially, that the Indians have not been given access to any share of it at all. So next slide, please. And the treaties, even though they have been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada, for example, the treaty rights hunt and fish as they always had of the Mi'kmaq people. That was dating back to a treaty before the Treaty of Niagara, when the settlers first came through that part of Canada, and a treaty of about 17 in the 1750s. And that treaty was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999, and yet still, I'm reading this week of Mi'kmaq lobster fishers having their boats damaged by government officials, having their traps confiscated because the government, it doesn't quite know how to deal with the fact that the treaty rights give the Indians certain hunting and fishing privileges that other people in Canada don't have. So rather than deal with complaints from the majority of people that live in Canada, they would rather ignore the rights of the minority, the Indigenous peoples. I saw your prayer talked about bullying. It's almost a form of bullying that's allowed to taking place. And this Mi'kmaq member of Parliament, Jamie Baptiste, said that politicians today only move as far as their voters allow them. And if the voters don't understand things like treaty rights, well, that's a challenge. And that's why it's important that we have these sessions like we're having today and this week in Treaties Recognition Week. So the fishermen and the judges and the MPs and the lawyers and the doctors and the journalists of the future, people like you, students, you're going to understand the importance of recognizing treaty rights. Next. So everybody, I often, if we were meeting in person, I would ask for a show of hands, how many people in our meeting have treaty rights? Well, everybody in Canada has treaty rights. Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous people. We all have treaty rights. Those treaties are still in force. Some people call them historic treaties. There's no expiry date. Many of them, as I've said, are still wending their way through the courts because many reasons. The promises were not kept. Indians were not allowed to have lawyers to represent their interests. They couldn't understand the language. The things that they were told verbally were not the same things that were written down in the treaty. There are many reasons, and Canada is being forced by its own rule of law to observe these promises that were made by their predecessor governments. And Canadians wonder, even though why the next slide, even though the importance of treaties is recognized and affirmed by Canada's highest law, the Constitution, Canadians, I think, wonder if it's in our Constitution, how come even the government, is guilty of ignoring the promises that were made? It's because you can have things in a Constitution that sound really good and positive, but in our system of government, that's not enough to have a promise. You have to pass a law that puts that promise into effect. So a promise by itself in the Canadian system of government means nothing unless there's a law to accompany it. And in most of these cases, there have not been specific laws to support what the Constitution says. You might wonder if Canada didn't adopt a system of government that to suit that situation. And interestingly, since last July, as one of the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended, that all new citizens to Canada have to swear, in addition to swearing allegiance to the Crown in Canada, and now it would be King Charles III, and to uphold the laws of Canada. Now, also the citizenship oath since last July includes a provision that they are going to also support what the Constitution says, the recognition of treaty rights of peoples. Now, that's really ironic that new citizens are being asked to swear that when their own government does not those promises, but that's the way that the system of government. So next, that may be the last one. So, that's my presentation to you, and it's and I just want to add that that I encourage teachers and students. We've talked a lot today about Canada's past, and it's important to know about our past. But what's more important is that Canadians are aware of the contributions, not just historic, like defending Canada, but the current contributions that Indigenous peoples of North America continue to make. And for example, in my community in North Bay, there are 50,000 people, 8,000 of them are Indigenous. We contribute $260 million a year to the city's economy. In every field in Canada, there are Indigenous peoples who are making important contributions. If you're a sports fan, you should know who Carey Price is. He's one of the best goalies that have ever played hockey. He's getting closer to retirement. His mother is an Indian chief in British Columbia. Carey Price, in addition to being a great athlete, does a lot of charity work. He's a wonderful role model. There are great artists, Indigenous artists. Some of them are named people like Leland Bell, and lives in Sudbury near me. And one of the greatest artists known all around the world was Norval Morrisseau, who's passed on now, Indigenous artist. And the current president of the Canadian Medical Association is a Cree man from Saskatchewan. His name is Dr. Lalita Lafontaine. Current president of the Canadian Bar Association is a Métis lawyer in Manitoba. And I'll end by saying, just to show how much we have contributed and will continue to contribute. As I speak to you right now, 258 miles over our heads, the International Space Station is circling the globe. The commander of that space station is Colonel Nicole Mann. And Colonel Mann is a United States Marine Corps officer. She is a mother. She is a wife. She is a trained pilot, a fighter pilot. She flew 47 combat missions against the Taliban in Iraq and Afghanistan for the United States. She has landed on aircraft carriers 200 times. She has 25,000 hours of flying time with 25 different aircraft. She's an extremely accomplished person who also happens to be an enrolled member of the Round Valley tribe of Indians in northern. I tell Indigenous students who sometimes are made to feel that they're not as accomplished or as good as other people in their classes or their country. There's nothing you can achieve if you have the same access to education and training. And Colonel Mann was not the first North American Indigenous person in space. In 2004, Colonel John Harrington did 3 spacewalks. He's a Chickasaw Indian from the southern part of the United States. So understand our past, learn about it, look for all of the good things that happened in the past. A lot of them did. Remember that we have a lot of work to do in Canada to keep treaty promises. With treaty rights come responsibilities. But also remember that Indigenous peoples continue to make contributions that make our country, our societies better. And so I wish you all success as students, those that are listening, and as teachers. You teachers, don't be afraid to teach your subject because you didn't learn about it in school. It's challenging, but I know that I've met some wonderful teachers who are doing great work in their schools and communities. So miigwech, thank you for listening to me, and I hope all you students get A's this year.
Thank you so much, Maurice. We really appreciate you coming and spending your time to teach us about treaties. It's such an important piece of history to recognize, and I think especially during this week of remembrance, not just in terms of Remembrance Day, but also honoring Treaties Recognition Week. It's really important, and I really love what you said about, you know, it's one thing to know your history, but to really know what's happening currently, right, is really, really important. Even, you know, really looking at with a critical eye, looking at the 94 calls to action, and how young people, all of you young people who are, you know, part of this session, can grow up and help change this nation for the better. So thank you so much, Maurice. We wish you a wonderful day, and thank you to everyone who has attended. A recording of this will be available, and the link will be shared out probably this afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Take care.